Hello and welcome to a special GZERO Media live stream. I'm Jeanna Smialek, the Federal Reserve and economics reporter at the New York Times. This program is part of a Webby-nominated Global Stage series produced in partnership with GZERO and Microsoft. We're coming to you this afternoon from inside the World Bank headquarters in Washington, where the spring meetings of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund are underway. This is a high-level gathering of finance ministers and policymakers from around the world, and obviously one that's happening at a critical moment. Over the next hour, we'll bring you interviews with some of those leaders here to discuss financing the future in a time of crisis. And we'll hear from you as well. Ahead of this program, GZERO asked its followers across social media for their thoughts on key issues that we'll be talking about today. Here's the first poll. GZERO asked, globally, economic inequality is A, improving, B, getting worse, or C, about the same. You answered, 31% said it was improving, 49% said getting worse, and 20% said getting about the same. And that's where our conversation today begins. I'm about to be joined by David Malpass, who is recently meeting with the Ukrainian President Zelensky, and he will be with us in just a moment. And for now, I am here with, as we wait for him, I am here with Ian Bremmer, President of the Eurasia Group and GZERO Media. Welcome, Ian.
Absolutely, hi.
So I want to start out with just your reaction to the poll we just heard. Where do you think we are in terms of inequality, and how is the current moment impacting that trajectory?
I think it's getting worse, absolutely. We're on the back of 2 years of pandemic, and certainly the IMF, the World Bank, did a lot to try to ensure that the people that were worst hit by the pandemic were not going to fall off a cliff. But now on the back of that, we have very significant inflation. We have real serious supply chain problems in terms of food, in terms of fertilizer, in terms of energy. And the producers of those commodities will be fine, but everybody else won't be. And so I think that is, from a global lens, something that makes pretty much everyone that follows these issues concerned that global inequality is going to have more stresses going forward, not less. And just the number of people that are here at the IMF World Bank annual meetings that are saying, we desperately need your help or we're going to fall apart, like those numbers are going up.
And do you see anything happening at a global level that could help to avert that deepening of these divides?
Well, certainly a ceasefire would make a difference in the near term, but I don't think that's going to happen, right? I mean, this is the biggest geopolitical rift that we've seen since the wall has come down. It is that big. It is a war in Europe. There are 5 million Ukrainian refugees in the last 8 weeks. It is the largest grain producer in the world, invading the 5th largest. Russia isn't, I mean, it's integrated in the global economy, but what they do is they take stuff out of the ground and they sell it. And now we're telling them they're an international pariah. President Biden said that a genocide is being committed by the Russian president. He says a war criminal. So business as usual with Russia is not remotely conceivable in the foreseeable future, as long as Putin's in charge, for the United States and for the advanced industrial democracies. That makes me feel like this has suddenly changed the trajectory of a decent piece of globalization.
That is such an interesting point, because this has been the hottest topic around these meetings so far, I think, is this idea that we might be staging some major retreat from globalization. And I wonder what you make of that assertion. Is globalization dead? Is it dying? Where are we on that trajectory, and what does it mean?
I don't think it's dead, but I think the last 50 years, the single biggest trend in the world that has created a global middle class was the fact that goods and services and ideas and people and capital were moving faster and faster across all global borders. There are a lot of things that were already making that a bigger challenge before the war in Ukraine. The very fact that you had so much populism in the United States and Europe, and you had America first, but then with Biden, you had a foreign policy for an American middle class. Friendshoring, right? This is all about, we're not doing globalization, we're inserting politics into where we want our capital to go. And we're particularly doing that at home for our workers who've been taking it on the chin and they're voting that way. But then on top of that, you have this war. And you're taking the 11th largest economy in the world, though not for very long, and you're telling them, we're literally going to deglobalize you. That's a very big deal, right? And furthermore, their biggest friend on the global stage is China. And China is going to be the largest economy in the world. My president has said that this is a conflict between democracies and autocracies. So we're saying that there's a conflict between the United States and our allies and Russia and its ally, China. What does that mean for the future of globalization? Do you think that's going to make it easier for trade and investment and capital to flow between the West and China? I suspect it's going to make it harder. I don't think that's a good thing, but I think that's where we are. And so that unnerves me when we talk about where globalization is going.
It's a lot to take on. We are now joined by David Malpass. Thank you so much for joining us, the World Bank Group President, hot from a meeting with Zelensky. I wonder if you could walk us through what you heard in your last meeting, what sort of the big takeaways were.
Well, first, hello to both of you. From the meeting that we just had, so there's Ukraine is under attack from Russia. The invasion is causing damage and loss of lives. And you can see the outpouring in the global community of support. That's what's happening. Actually, the meeting is still going on now. So President Zelensky projected in from somewhere in Ukraine to the meeting. The Prime Minister of Ukraine is here now, along with the Finance Minister. And there's been several announcements of additional support during the day today. World Bank is packaging, is putting together, and we built it on our own programs, and then we're adding to it through grants, also guarantees, also parallel financing. So there's different mechanisms that countries around the world are using to put support into Ukraine so they can maintain government services.
Interesting. And President Zelensky quoted at the outset of that meeting, we caught a little bit of it before we got on stage here, that he expects there will be something like $500 billion of damage to recover from as this conflict progresses. How does an economy bounce back from that? How do you at the World Bank sort of foam the runway so that they can recover from this kind of damage?
We're working on plans, so part of that is the very near term, so how much per month for the next 3 months, then a medium-term program, and then getting to the long term of how do you rebuild a nation whose infrastructure has been bombed, the port facilities have been closed, and the Prime Minister was just explaining the mining that Russia has been doing, meaning before they pull out, they put mines so there has to be that kind of operation done as well. And so it will take a global community effort to really help with that process. But a lot of it then, as we see in the war, comes from the Ukrainian people themselves. So they are working, and we just heard the planting season is starting, or the cycle, and they are eager to plant and to grow crops and then get those crops to market. So there'll be a huge drive from Ukraine itself.
That's interesting. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because obviously Ukraine, huge grain exporter, Russia, huge oil exporter. This is a war that's having ramifications beyond economic ramifications, far beyond their borders, which has been a major topic of these meetings. I wonder how you see the conflict in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, affecting the world's economic prospects this year.
It's hurting, and one aspect of that is when energy prices go up, then it causes a cost burden on all sorts of businesses, the fertilizer business, the agriculture business, transportation around the world. So those costs are dead weight costs. They can't be recovered. Now, as the world begins to make more things to fill the gap caused by Russia, that will cause growth and investment, and that's one of the emphases I'm making, that we need to build new supply around the world to take the place of the supply that's being lost. That's not just energy and agriculture, but even manufactured goods and so on. So there'll be some positive side of it, but in the initial stages, it's just plain negative. That's caused us to take down, and the IMF to take down, our growth forecast. That's one way to measure it. And in the case of Ukraine itself, it's this loss of infrastructure, huge amount of destruction that's been taking place. World Bank has been, we tried to move immediately after the invasion to try to have techniques for putting actual cash and disbursements into Ukraine. And so I'm happy we were able to do that. We had previous instruments that could be reopened and reactivated, and so that helped with the cash flow effort. But then as we go forward, there will be projects from a global community. In the meeting right now going on is the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, also EIB, European Infrastructure Bank, and so there's a substantial Europe effort and bilateral. There were 20 finance ministers in the room who have programs going of various sorts to help Ukraine and also Eastern Europe as a whole. The refugee situation and displaced persons is a giant problem. Ian and I have discussed the situation in the Caucasus. Russia, invaded Georgia in 2008, and that is still there. It's still causing disruption, and other countries as well. And so these efforts are a global community effort, and particularly Europe.
Ian, I wonder if you could react to some of the things David was saying there. In particular, I wonder what you think the political ramifications of that movement in supply chains might be.
Well, one of the things that is so important here, 20 countries, 20 finance ministers sitting together with the Ukrainian government saying, we want to help. I think that it has been enormously impressive that there has been such a multilateralization, principally among the world's wealthiest economies, to do everything possible to get the Ukrainians on their feet, to allow them to beat back the Russian military, and also, of course, to cause real damage to Russia. But I want to be clear that when the Ukrainian president is mostly talking to leaders over the past 8 weeks, the first thing he's been saying is, we need weapons, because his country is being attacked. And it's hard to rebuild the country at the same time that an active war is going on. That war in the Donbass is going to grow. Zelensky has said that the new phase has already started. I don't quite agree there. I think that the Russians are being much more focused and thoughtful in the way that they are trying to attack militarily this time around. They are getting all their troops in place. They're testing what the Ukrainian defenses look like. This is going to get a lot worse over the coming weeks. It's not going to be over on May 9th and Victory Day. It'll probably take a couple more months. And then if they take all of Donbass, are the Ukrainians simply going to accept that, or are they going to try to counterattack? So I do think that at the same time that this process that David is talking about is absolutely essential, an enormous amount of money that allow the Ukrainians to get through their planting season, to rebuild their country, to start bringing back some of these refugees, we have to recognize that this remains an active war zone, and there is no negotiations process that looks remotely like it's going to succeed in the foreseeable near-term future.
Absolutely, and that is a great lead-in actually to our next poll question. GZERO asked, Russia's war in Ukraine will have the most global impact on A, energy prices, B, food security, or C, supply chains. GZERO's followers answered 47% energy prices, 40% food security, and 13% supply chains. While I have you both here on stage, I'd also like to ask about China, because obviously they are the elephant in the room with all of these discussions about Ukraine and Russia. David, in what ways, in your mind, is China's zero COVID policy impacting its economy, and will there be long-run implications from that?
Well, there's clearly changes going on in the world in terms of dependency, or move away from dependence on Russia for natural gas, but also supply chains needing to be diversified from China. That's been ongoing for a while. It was probably overdue, and it's probably good for China in the long run not to have quite so much many countries around the world dependent on particular goods coming from China. So then you have to say, okay, out over the next 5 years, 10 years, and so on, which parts of the world will be good at allocating capital to various types of goods and services. So big data is one goods and services. Chips, telecommunications chips and other kinds of chips are another. And China's been, had pretty good luck so far in picking the various product lines they're going to dominate, which is good for their competitiveness, but a big challenge for the rest of the world. So I think we're going into a phase where the world will be assessing supply chains, and there's clearly going to be some effort toward nearshoring, to having friend groups or groups that you trust to become integrated within your supply chains. China, I imagine, will be doing that with countries that it's comfortable with as well. I think one of the big challenges for the world right now is the immediacy of the inflation challenge. As shortages hit, prices go up. And there needs to be a robust supply response. I also think there needs to be, as the central banks remove accommodation, they need to be particularly aware of the need to have it be helpful to supply. That means small businesses have more credit so that they can engage in the logistics. China spoke today at our spring meetings and at the IMFC meeting, and made the point that they're looking for ways to enable smaller businesses in China. So that's welcome, of course, but that's also another part of the competitiveness challenge. They have been able to reduce their reserve requirement from the central bank, so they're actually managing to achieve a loosening phase as their economy slows down. So that's stabilizing for them, and it's something that as the world looks for a soft landing from the inflation, that's going to be a challenge for the other central banks as well.
Do you think the other central banks will be able to pull off a soft landing?
I think they have the tools. Clearly, for one, you can meet a lot of inflation with robust supply. Get everyone producing things, and prices are going to go down. Even if you say it today, that you're going to create an environment that's conducive to new investment and new supply, then the markets are going to take a look at that and say, boy, I shouldn't be stockpiling. I should be selling into the price spike. I hope that can be achieved, and the central banks have a lot of tools they could be using. For example, they're already talking about shrinking their balance sheets. I think that's liberating of capital, because as one balance sheet shrinks, other people can have access to that money. They also are storing, the central banks are storing a huge amount of duration. They're owning long duration assets. That really locks up, or that benefits a narrow group of the world's capital structure. So I think there's ample room for the central banks to balance that out some by reducing the duration of what they're holding in terms of assets. We'll have to see how they do it. I think it's critical. This inflation problem is really hitting poor people, and it hits developing countries the hardest, and so it's destabilizing in that direction.
I will come back to you on that because I'm very interested in that topic. But before I do, I would just want to complete sort of the China theme. Ian, I wonder what you think President Xi Jinping takes from what has happened in Ukraine. Is that emboldening, or is it perhaps a cautionary tale?
Oh, it's not emboldening, because both Putin and Xi Jinping thought this was a special military operation. I mean, the reason that Putin called it that is because he thought it was between 3 days and 2 weeks. The Ukrainians weren't going to fight, they were going to liberate, and there wasn't going to be much of an international reaction. Xi Jinping was surprised by that. This isn't good, because the fact that this is a war that's ongoing, and Xi Jinping's best friend on the international stage, that he signed this friendship without limits on February 4th when they were together in Beijing at the Olympics, suddenly is seen as a pariah, not just by the US, but by the Europeans too. If you're China, you don't like that. You don't like the guilt by association. Furthermore, when the Americans go to China and they say, you do not send military support to Russia, you do not do business with the Russians that break our sanctions, or else they'll be held to pay. Even Janet Yellen, who I consider to be maybe the most dovish member of the US cabinet on China, came out 2 days ago and said there will be serious consequences if the Chinese are seen to backfill Russia's trade. And the Chinese aren't stupid. They've got lawyers, they've got bankers, they understand that the United States is in a dominant economic position. They're not going to break American sanctions, but they are deeply unhappy about it. And the relationship between China and the United States right now is completely absent of trust. There's very little high-level direct regular contact going on, and the policies aren't in any way aligned. So when David talks about friendshoring, and he's not the only one, everyone's talking about friendshoring right now, we need to understand what that means. Friendshoring is not globalization. Friendshoring is the insertion of politics into investment and trade decisions that says, what you're going to do will be invest much more in countries that are politically aligned with you. 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, the presumption was that China would be one of those countries. The presumption was that over time, China was going to become the largest economy, but it would politically and economically reform to integrate more with the United States and other comparatively free market democracies. Nobody believes that anymore. And now that they don't believe it, we're turning to friendshoring. What does that mean for China? Confrontation. That's what it means. There will be an economic cost to pay as a consequence of that. There's a price for that.
Interesting. And on a final note, my last question is for David. I wonder if you could walk us through what you expect this moment of high inflation, and particularly high food inflation, to mean for poorer countries around the globe, and what the World Bank, if anything, can do to help alleviate some of that pain.
It has a direct impact. The poorer the country and the poorer the family, the bigger percentage they spend of their budget on food. So as food goes up, it's a relative price increase. And we see now more and more countries where food is going up faster than the CPI. And so you could quantify that and just say that's going to add to poverty, that adds to fragility in some of the countries facing that. And so countries can respond to that by enabling their farmers. I've been advocating that the advanced economies open their markets more, recognize that this is a moment to make friends, to help people that don't have as much. And that means really looking at all your trade barriers, all your blockages, all your subsidies for things that aren't really necessary, and cut them back so that there can be more room. This goes also into the fiscal policies and the monetary policies, where it's really important that there be a reduction in the accommodation. The accommodation it turned out to be inflationary, and so as that's reduced, do it in a way that enables production and supply. That means differences in how we're shifting from demand stimulus, which was the accommodation policy, to now removing that accommodation. And unfortunately, it's been primarily higher interest rates. That is exactly focused on the poorer countries, smaller businesses, ones that rely on floating interest rate debt, which adds to the pressure from the food price spike.
Absolutely. Challenging times. Well, David Malpass, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Ian Bremmer is going to stay with us for the remainder of the hour. We spoke about the impact the war in Ukraine is having both regionally and globally. There are a few places that more acutely understand that situation than the Baltic nations. GZERO spoke to Lithuania's finance minister, Gintarė Skaistė. Here's some of what she had to say.
There's always feeling about what will happen next, because one crisis after another. Previously it was pandemic situation, and Lithuanian economy was quite resistant to this pandemic crisis. Afterwards it was a migrants crisis, because from Belarus there were coming migrants brought by the Lukashenko regime just to have a pressure to Lithuania. Afterwards we are having this energy crisis, the inflation rate, also the war in Ukraine. and I'm always thinking what could happen next. But we're living with what we do have, and I think Lithuanian economy showed some quite big resilience to all the shocks that could happen somewhere nearby. And I think mostly because we were prepared to that situation that we do have now. And especially if we're talking about the energy prices shock and energy shock, and about the sanctions when the European countries try to say goodbye to all energy goods from Russia and stop buying gas, oil and coal. I think Lithuania is one of the countries that are best prepared to do that, and we already decided not to buy gas from Russia anymore. And I think it is because we were preparing to the situation long ago.
So you were positioned, you had already been positioning your energy sector to have different sources of gas to come in, not just Russian gas. And I'm wondering, are you now also, given the EU's Fit for 55 and the entire move to move away from gas and fossil fuels in general, are you also taking a look at moving from gas? Is there kind of a longer range plan past the LNG?
Yes, definitely, and we have the strategy for longer term. It started in 2010, but it definitely will continue in upcoming years, and we have the plan to have energy from the renewables, 93% of all the energy in 2030 already. So there is a big plan and big investment coming there, not only from the European funds, but also we are preparing sustainable finance strategy and try to collect all the possible financing that we could have, not only from the public sector, but also from the private sector, to have this renewables coming into force much more than it is now.
Mm-hmm. So very well positioned right now to get off of the Russian gas, but then also positioning yourself to get over into an energy transition in a more general sense.
We have strategy for all the fields, not only gas, but also electricity. And I would say that there is quite a big plan for the renewables in upcoming years, with a lot of fundings, but also with regulation changes, because there is still quite difficult to implement some new projects when you're talking about renewables, wind energy or solar energy, but there's some restrictions and also some additional documentation that you have to prepare and everything, and we are just easing the way that how the renewables are coming to our lives, and there are quite big plans upcoming, and we have a strategy to have more than 19% of total energy from renewables in 2030, and it's quite a challenge. And I would say in 2030, Lithuania will be one of the frontier runners in this field.
That's great, and it's interesting. You've got this broad goal, but it sounds like you've really dug down into the details of how to implement it. Not so many people think about like the siting and the criteria and the paperwork. It's not the sexy part of the whole thing, but it's really important. I'm moving on from the energy for a second. I know inequality because income gap and inequality within countries is a big deal right now, and the UN report has recently cited that 75% of the global population live in countries where the income gap and inequality has widened. And I know that this is an issue that you as a finance minister inside of Lithuania have looked at a lot, and I'm wondering how you are thinking of addressing it and what you see the risks happening from such an inequality.
Maybe there is two tracks. One of them is a short term, another one is a longer term measures that we could have. Me being announced as the Minister of Finance, one of the priorities was lowering the income inequality, because I really think that is a problem in Lithuania, and we already made some strategic reforms that will help definitely in the numbers in this year already, and in the next year in the pensions increase, and also with lower income earners, also lowering their taxation and other decisions that were already made. But if we're talking about this short term and this energy crisis, the government presented the very big plan for this lowering inflation consequences and smoothing inflation consequences, and also energy independence strengthening. It is a plan from 2.2 billion euros. It's almost 4% of GDP of Lithuania, so it's quite a big amount. Half of it is dedicated to this transition of our economy, how to get energy independence, to use more renewables, to lower energy consumption in the households, renovation processes. And much of these projects are dedicated to the socially affected people that with a lower income. And the other part is 1 billion euros is dedicated to the higher energy prices, but what is really a problem for lower income people, and also increasing the revenues of lower income people especially. It is very targeted very targeted measures that are dedicated just to those people who are affected the most with inflation and energy prices rise.
And that was Lithuanian Finance Minister Gintarė Skaistė. Ian, one of the things that Minister Skaistė was talking about was this idea that the poor are most affected by inflation. And I wonder if you could kind of react to what that means from a political perspective. What do you think the longer run implications of today's inflation could potentially be?
Well, what it means is countries where social contracts aren't seen to be effective are going to see more whipsaw anti-establishment voting patterns. I mean, you see that in France, Macron is going to win, but Le Pen's votes are overwhelmingly from the poor, who feel like the establishment's doing nothing for them. Inflation is driving a lot of that. In the United States, Biden numbers are being pushed lower. Why? In large part because of inflation. So across Latin America, I mean, you're just seeing this anti-establishment throw whatever bum we happen to have in there out because they don't care about us. One of the few countries where it's a big exception to that is Mexico. Because in Mexico, you actually have someone who has crusaded on just the anti-corruption, I will do everything possible for the poor. And even though he hasn't been very effective, they trust him. They believe him. And so his approval ratings are still around 60% after a few years in office. Gaudy for any political leader in this environment because he's connecting with that group of disaffected people. Most countries, political leaders don't have that luxury.
It's an interesting point. As we're talking about the disruption to supply chains, the escalation of already high food prices, we have two perfect guests to talk about this topic. We're joined now by Rania Al-Mashat, Egypt's Minister of International Cooperation. Thank you for joining us. And Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the Minister of Finance for Indonesia. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to you both. Minister Al-Mashat, I'd like to start with you. Obviously, Egypt has a relationship with Russia. You are a major grain importer. And I wonder if you could walk me through what this moment means for you, both economically and politically.
Well, for every country in the world, there is an impact of what we're seeing economically. So Egypt is no exception in that. And I think the discussion that we heard earlier, whether it's commodity prices, fuel prices, the disruption in trade, all of this has implications on countries that are just moving out of COVID. We were maybe a month ago in a very different discussion, the recovery, the return of tourism, and so forth. Today, the discussion is very different. We had to very quickly think of safety nets. We had to very quickly think of mitigation impact for the public. So the cost of grains as they were going up, we kept the subsidies and the prices of bread on ration cards the same, but nonetheless there was an increase in the price of bread which is not on ration cards. So every country is moving to try and mitigate as much as possible the immediate impact. Nonetheless, the realization is this is going to have longer implications, and that's why today, as we are with the spring meetings here at the World Bank and the IMF, trying all together to think of collective action where institutions can actually help countries push forward with the recovery, or actually try and stave off a little bit of the implications. I just want to say that a few facts that people may not know about Egypt. We have diversified the imports of wheat a while back. So this is also, even though we're the biggest importer of wheat, Ukraine and Russia are key markets, but there have also been other markets. Something else which happened a few years ago is investment in silos for storage of wheat. And that's why our strategic stock lasts up until September. And there has been more investment in domestic agriculture of wheat. So these are a few facts that may not have made it to the headlines, but that has also helped us tremendously in this shock because there was a preemptive action a while back.
That's fascinating. And it's so interesting, as you mentioned, the measures you've taken have kind of been for the immediate fallout. You specifically mentioned that you have these silos of grain that last until September. I wonder, how do you plan for the future in an environment like this? What do you do after September, and what do those conversations look like right now?
I mean, you know, there's it's a question that is on each and every policymaker's mind. And when we talk about food security, we'll link that to the climate agenda as well, because if we're talking about agriculture, water, the investments in trying to keep the regional supply chains moving, but the diversification to other exporters of wheat. India is today being presented as a market that could, I won't say fully substitute, but at least provide supply for some of the grains that the world needs. So, you know, more incentives for domestic production, and that is an action that has been taken domestically, and also trying to find whether within the region or substitute markets for the imports of wheat and grains.
And Minister Indrawati, Indonesia will host the G20 summit later this year in what promises to be an extremely uncertain moment for the global economy, for global politics. And I wonder if you could sort of pull out your crystal ball for us and talk a little bit about what you think is going to be on that agenda. What are the big topics that are going to define 2022?
Well, the presidency of the Indonesia of this G20, we've already outlined the agenda. For the finance track, there are two tracks in this case, Sherpa track and the finance track. On the finance track, we are discussing on the 5 area of the important issue. Of course, the first one, before the war in Ukraine, talking about exit strategy and scarring effect because of the pandemic. Now, of course, this is going to be on the economic outlook and risk. This is going to be more risk coming from the war and the spillover because of the food, energy price, inflation, followed by the interest rate. So it's going to be really, really hard for many countries because they've already have the high debt. And then we are also talking about the pandemic, how we are going to prepare better for the next threat on the pandemic. That's why we talk about the pandemic preparedness response, including financial facility, which is now being supported by many countries. I think I'm optimistic that we are going to be able to achieve that creation of the financing facility to strengthen the WHO and all multilateral institutions. We also talk about international financial architecture, which is talking about the IMF as the global financial safety net, with many countries is going to be in a very difficult position because they've already have a high debt due to the COVID, or even before that, now with the interest rate increase, I think, and then growth is going to be lower. That will also create a very difficult combination for many countries on the debt. And then we talk also about a common framework. This is how country can settle their debt situation, especially with the creditor, which is now becoming so diverse. In the past, maybe dominated by the Paris Club. Now it is also China, which is very important creditor. So how they are going to work out on this kind of situation and composition of the creditor, which is different. We talk about sustainable finance, which is also very critical because climate change, which is Egypt is going to host for the COP27. The link between how the climate change and the commitment to reduce CO2 can only be actually done through the availability of financing. And that's why the discussion about financing for our sustainable or climate change program is going to be very important, especially not only from the public sector, but also from the private sector. We also talk about the global taxation. I think this is also one of very important achievement of the G20. So actually the agenda of the G20 in itself is still very, very important. And all countries, in my consultation with all members, because G20 governance is based on consensus. This is not like the World Bank or the IMF, in which you have quota-based share, which is based on how much that you contribute on the capital. G20 is a club, is a forum. They are created at the ministerial level after the ASEAN financial crisis, and then elevated to the leaders level after the global financial crisis 2008-2009. And that's why the representation of all the countries from different regions creating a strength, but also a challenge for us to have a consensus. Before this war, maybe the consensus is relatively easy. Now it's becoming so fragmented and divided. So this is going to be a new challenge and a new race globally, but also for the economic challenge, this is going to be very difficult.
Ian, you were nodding enthusiastically. I wonder if you have a reaction to that.
This last point by the minister is so absolutely critical. I mean, the G20 was set up because we understood after the 2008 financial crisis that we needed a global response. You look at the pandemic, it's so obvious. We need a global response.
Right.
You look at climate change, it's so obvious. We need a global response. This war with Russia invading Ukraine is the exact opposite of that. This is a war that is literally ripping apart the fabric of geopolitics today, and it is a spike pointed at the G20. I mean, we just had a finance ministers meeting, and a number of developed economies decided that they weren't going to be in the room when the Russian minister was going to speak. What's going to happen? I was just speaking before the event just now with the minister asking about Putin. She said, yeah, Putin's coming. Okay, well, Biden's coming. How's that going to go? And if they decide they're going to walk out, what are the Chinese going to do? I mean, the potential for this to literally rip, we're talking about a new Cold War between Russia and the advanced industrial economies. The G20 stage has the potential to help drive that into a much greater rift with the wealthy democracies on one side, Russia and China on the other, and a bunch of middle income economies that are saying, we want no part of any of this. If that happens, it's the opposite of everything that we are trying to accomplish in terms of global response to global crises. And let's hope it doesn't happen. I personally am thankful that the Indonesians are hosting the G20 this year, because they're a country that knows they need to talk with and have good relations with everyone. I mean, if the Canadians were hosting the G20 this year, it would be more challenging in terms of inviting the Russians to that meeting, and that would have knock-on effects. I think we have to recognize that.
Well, interestingly, I think because this is a consensus-based forum, so since last meeting in February when the finance minister and central bank governor met, that was like just almost, the war almost started. But we invited, and they are come, some virtually, of course, at the time because of the Omicron. But since then, the situation has been shifted dramatically. But for us, as a presidency, we consult with all the member countries. And individually, they are all agree first that Indonesia is not in a pleasant position, so they sympathize with us. The second one is actually they are all agree that this forum of cooperation need to be preserved. Of course, the question regarding how you are going to respond if a party is violating this kind of international rule, what kind of cooperation, and that's why this kind of cooperation should be based on trust, mutual respect, and also allowing this international rule that will be respected is going to be in a very, very dire test with this kind of situation. So we try to do our best as a host by communicating to all countries in this case, and what kind of format of the meeting, and of course it is not only about logistical format, if you are going to speak, you are going to leave the room, but it's more on, are you agree that the agenda that we have is still very, very important, climate change, pandemic, global debt, especially low-income country debt, and of course how we are going to escape, or in this case manage, this very complex policy challenge for all of us. High inflation, high interest rate, low growth, high food price, energy price, which is always very volatile politically and socially. So it is very critical for all of us to continue working together. They recognize that, all member countries, they are all recognize that. That's why it's helped us in managing this meeting so then how we can make this discussion and the agenda need to be continued implemented, need to make a progress, while there is a really significant difference, especially related to this war.
And Minister Al-Mashat, I actually wonder if I could follow up with you on the climate change issue, because Egypt is hosting COP27 this year. And I wonder, how you see the war in Ukraine changing sort of the pace and the tone around our move away from carbon-based fuel sources, around sort of the dedication to combating climate change.
So as much as it looks challenging, there is an opportunity, because when we look at the fuel and the interruption, the possibility for renewables and the possibility for depending more on green hydrogen, and the possibility of creating transmission lines from in our case, Egypt to Europe and so forth, depending on renewables, this is an opportunity. So despite how murky it looks, there are examples and there are ways to draw private sector investments into countries. But let me focus on the message of COP27. It's from pledges and commitments to implementation. We want it to be an implementation COP. And for that to happen, there needs to be a way for all the private sector commitments that were made in Glasgow to make their ways to countries. And the only way to do that is if more climate finance, ODA, is presented to actually de-risk some of the private sector investments. So despite the conversation today on the immediate impact of the war, the humanitarian effect, and so on. But the climate issue is one which is a common denominator. It will continue to be there. And what we want to emphasize, for example, adaptation was very big in Glasgow. We want to push that further because of the importance of agriculture for food security. This is what we're seeing today. So if we are able to increase investments in, and there's a misconception that private sector does not make money from adaptation. That is not the case. We want to show that no, on the contrary, and this war has shown that. So there is, if you will, several spots that we need to keep on emphasizing and pushing forward. If I look at the G24 communique, which came out a few days ago, despite the fuel, food, fertilizer, and financial shocks, there was a section dedicated on climate, and this is important, and dedicated in these terms of de-risking and trying to draw in the private sector investments that are needed in the countries. So we will continue to push that message forward, and also use life examples of projects and partnerships that worked in countries and see how we can scale those in other places.
Great. Rania Al-Mashat and Shri Indrawati, thank you both so much for joining us today. We are going to move on to an interview with Vicki Robinson from Microsoft. GZERO's Global Stage series explores the issues at the intersection of technology, politics, and society, and she is speaking on those issues in the video you are about to see.
The reality is that the pandemic and the war has shown the importance of being online, and for those who aren't online, what it actually translates into from an economic and social perspective. And so it is absolutely critical When you think about what took place during the pandemic, for example, when we were forced to work at home and learn at home and get access to health care, not being able to do those things places an automatic limit on your ability to be productive and has major ramifications for our society. So I do believe, and many of us believe in this space, that digital access universally is critical for us.
Headlines right now, you see things like rising hunger. Obviously, there's a war happening in Ukraine. There are conflicts happening in other places globally. How do you keep people focused on an issue like digital access when it seems like there are so many more immediate needs?
Part of these things are taking place online and being able to be informed. And so taking a step back, the pandemic kind of forced us to be indoors and sheltering in and really increased the level of digitization across the country, across the world, really. And so as people had access to that, and you're thinking about getting news and dealing with misinformation, a real way to do that is by being online. And so while there are certainly very pressing problems that present themselves today, this is a long-term issue that we have to get our arms around because it's not going away. In fact, there will be more digitization requiring more people to have access to internet as opposed to less.
The UN tracks 17 sustainable development goals. They're things like hunger and eradicating poverty and climate change. Almost all of them have experienced setbacks, if not enormous setbacks, over the period of the last couple of years. And now the war is only threatening them further. To what extent has that also impacted digital equity and the spread of digital access and connectivity? And are you concerned about it?
It may be a surprise to you, but I'm not concerned about it. And here's why. I think that even if you take all the challenges that we're facing as a world right now, one thing that one sort of upside to these challenges and things like the pandemic is that they make the case for the importance of being connected. There is a reason why connectivity and universal access is described by many as, SDG 0. In fact, the thought is that everything, if we really want to tackle some of these big problems and meet these SDGs in a fundamental way, attacking and getting our arms around digital access for all is a way that we can do it. And so I think I'm cautiously optimistic that if we can continue to keep the focus on this issue, that this will be a way to actually help accelerate progress on those SDGs.
Before we go, Ian Bremmer is still with me, and we have one more viewer poll to look at. GZERO Media asked, which of these has the greatest responsibility to solve global crises? Governments, private sector corporations, multilateral organizations, or all of the above? Viewers answered 28% governments, 4% private sector corporations, 5% multilateral organizations, and 63% all of the above. Pretty overwhelming response there. I wonder what your reaction to that is, Ian.
I think 10 years ago, it would have been similar, but governments would have been more like 50, 60%, and all the above would have been like 20%. And people increasingly don't believe that their governments have the capacity to do the lifting. Climate change is a piece of it. They've seen that the two largest carbon emitters in the world are not capable of doing the driving. And so who is? Well, a lot of young people, a lot of banks, a lot of corporations, the United Nations. They're seeing that it kind of takes a global village, if you will. And I mean, in part because governments are just seen as slow moving, and especially in democracies, crunch all you want, we'll make more. It just makes it a lot harder. And I think this is a reflection, this poll is a reflection of frustration that they don't know where to turn.
Interesting. And you have a book called The Power of Crises out next month.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the argument you're making in that?
It's believe it or not, it's a hopeful book. In an environment where over the last 30 years, we've all watched various parts of society sleepwalking towards the abyss, as Antonio Guterres says, the Secretary General. When NATO, when Macron was talking about NATO, French President Emmanuel Macron, just a few years ago, he said it was brain dead. And then after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, he said it had had electroshock therapy. it had been completely, adrift. And suddenly it has life, it has a mission. Why? Because there's a crisis, because there's an existential crisis. And the good news is that's not the only one. There are a number of existential crises out there, and the response for a world that has been adrift in global governance, adrift in social contract, adrift in how we think about the role that humanity plays together on this little ball that we live on. Suddenly, the crises are forcing us to take these things seriously. And the book is all about what those opportunities are.
Oh, does sound hopeful. Ian Bremmer, thank you so much for the time today.
Great to be with you.
And thanks to all of you for watching. Thank you for GZERO Media for having me and for hosting what has hopefully been a really hopeful and interesting discussion for all of our viewers. I'm Jeanna Smialek. Have a great evening.